Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up this week, analysing the big four ahead of the Tour de France. How do we rate the chances of Vingegaard, Pogačar, Roglič and Evenepoel with under 3 weeks to go until the start? I'll also be wrapping up the Critérium du Dauphiné, which had a cracking final stage, plus the Tour of Britain, ZLM Tour, Dwars Hageland, Volta Catalunya and the first stage of the Tour de Suisse. This week in the world of racing, we learned that even ASO get it wrong sometimes. Here's the lead group being taken the wrong way by the lead car at the Dauphiné last week. We also learned that mass crashes continue to haunt pro cycling. This one on stage 5 of the Critérium du Dauphiné involved so many riders, the stage had to be annulled due to a lack of medical provision left to cover the remainder of that particular stage. We also learned that Visma Lease Bike team boss Richard Plugger was busy handing out bottles at that race, and not just to his own riders either. That was a really class touch. And finally, we learned that whilst Primož Roglic won the Dauphiné, there are still question marks over his form ahead of the Tour de France. Before I get on to why, I'll run through how things panned out at the Dauphiné, which is generally seen as the warm-up race for the Tour de France. I already spoke about Mads Pedersen's opening stage win on last week's Racing News Show, but it was another Dane who took the stage win and the leader's jersey a day later. Magnus Cort Nielsen was the fastest to the line from the group that contested the win on top of the climb that day. Not that we really got to see all that much of it. The cloud cover was so bad, we barely saw the final few hundred metres of the stage. Magnus Cort's win there marked the first ever at World Tour level for his team Uno X. There was another exchange of the leader's jersey a day later on stage 3, which had a very popular winner. Most of you will remember the exploits of Derek G of Israel Premier Tech at last year's Giro, where he came oh so close to the win on so many occasions. Well, last Tuesday, he finally took his first pro win outside of Canadian National Championships. So he attacked inside the final kilometre, but was tracked down by Romain Gregoire of Groupama, who went straight past him. And it looked like that was that for G. But he clung on to the Frenchman, and he still had enough left in the tank to go back around him by the finish to take both the stage win and the leader's yellow jersey to boot. Which is what he wore on the stage 4 individual time trial the following day, where he pulled out another banger of a ride. Not quite enough to stay in the leader's jersey, but a very respectable 6th place on the day nonetheless. 2 young guns dominated that time trial. Josh Tarling of Ineos Grenadiers spent most of the day in the hot seat, having blitzed around the hilly course at an average speed of 49 kilometres per hour. Nobody came close at any of the splits until Remco Evenepoel rolled through them. The world champion was up at the first check, level pegging at the second, but then pulled out a monster final third to win by 17 seconds on the day. That was his 5th win of the season so far, and the 55th of his career. Tarling's consistency in time trials since turning pro is really quite staggering though. In fact, if you go the last 4 years since his junior days, Tarling has competed at 22 time trials according to First Cycling, and never been outside the top 3. The only time he's had a bad result, in inverted commas, against the clock was at last year's Tour of Norway prologue. He finished 17th there. That though had a decent climb in it, but as we saw over the rest of the Dauphiné, his climbing is coming along just nicely as well. After the neutralised stage 5, it was on to 3 consecutive days in the high mountains, all with summit finishes, and that was where it started to look a bit like the Primož Roglic show. On stage 6 to Le Col d'Aleva, he put 3 seconds into Ciccone to take the stage win, but more importantly, 42 seconds into Evenepoel, enough to put the Slovenian into the race lead. A lead he extended the next day to Samoa 1600, where he outsprinted Matteo Jorgensen to take a 2nd consecutive stage win. With Evenepoel losing more time that day, Roglic's lead into the 8th and final stage was a comfortable one. 1 minute and 2 seconds over Jorgensen, 1:13 over G, and with a strong team supporting him, it looks like a done deal. Except this is Roglic. It's never a done deal, even though he gets the deal done more often than not. Everything looked in hand until this point, with just 5.3 k's to go. This is Carlos Rodriguez attacking after what was a huge turn on the front by Ineos Grenadiers teammate Laurens de Plus. Up to that point, Roglic had looked in control, but as Jorgensen followed the attack, Roglic was suddenly a couple of bike lengths behind. 2 bike lengths then became 10, then 20, and all of a sudden there was a proper time gap. With his 2 closest rivals on GC in the front group, Roglic couldn't afford to lose more than 52 seconds, with the potential for Jorgensen to win the stage and take 10 bonus seconds with that. And for a long time, it still looked in hand. He was holding it at 15 to 20 seconds, but then with 2.5 Ks to go, it had gone over half a minute. Up front, G was distanced, leaving just Jorgensen and Rodriguez fighting it out for the stage win. The Spaniard took it, meaning Jorgensen only took 6 bonus seconds. Roglic, therefore, had to get to that finish line within 56 seconds, and it was an agonising wait. He did do it, but only with 8 seconds to spare. And it was a plot twist that I don't think many people were expecting, and certainly some high-level drama at the end of what had been quite a formulaic GC fight to that point. So, before I talk about Roglic, a word for a few others in the top 10 on GC at the race. First up, Jorgensen. In light of the crashes for Van Aert, Vingegaard and other high-profile riders from the team, Jorgensen has been Visma's most successful rider so far this season. He had a win at Paris-Nice, of course, and Dwars Vlaanderen, and he's now backed that up by the most impressive ride he's ever done in back-to-back high mountains, in my opinion at least. He will play a key role at the upcoming Tour de France, that's for sure. What's less sure is whether that will be as a secondary leader with his own freedom, or whether that's solely at the support of Jonas Vingegaard. Next up then, Derek G. His breakthrough performance was at last year's Giro d'Italia, but this was his breakthrough performance as a GC contender in races at this level. His peak 20 minutes on the final climb yesterday was 429 watts. That came at the end of a 4.5 hour stage and at the end of 3 consecutive mountain stages, so that is seriously impressive. Now, I don't think many of us thought of Derek G as a future Grand Tour contender, possibly not even Derek himself, but if the last 8 days are anything to go by, he's certainly got the physiological capacity to turn himself into one. He also has the time trialling ability, of course, and a classics pedigree, so he really does have all the characteristics you'd want to be a GC contender at the Grand Tours. Just behind G, in 4th, was Carlos Rodriguez. His stage win yesterday was just the 7th for his career so far, but 5 of them have come at World Tour level. He doesn't really have a sprint, so to speak, but at the end of a long day in the mountains, he is always there. In 5th, it was Laurens de Plus. He was awesome yesterday. The turn he did on the front was massive, and then he still had enough to finish 4th on the day. He will be an incredible helper at the Tour de France. Vlasov took 6th, despite working for Roglic the whole time. But the other standout result in the top 10 was Oya Lascano in 9th. We've all seen how strong he is in the one-day classics, but he's never climbed like he did last week. That was seriously impressive. For Roglic then, that was his 21st pro-level GC victory, putting him 1 ahead of Nairo Quintana in the active rider ranking list. He likes some nail-biting finishes though, doesn't he? This chart compiled by Amati Pirali on Twitter shows how close a lot of those wins have been. 4 of them by 8 seconds or less, 11 by under a minute. He gets the job done, doesn't he? The question is, can he get the job done at the Tour de France? Not on the form he displayed at the Dauphiné, is my opinion, but there is still just under 3 weeks to the start of the Tour and 5 until the start of a tough final week there. Now that might sound a little bit harsh, given that he's just won the key warm-up race for the Tour, but would peak Pogačar or peak Vingegaard been dropped by Jorgensen or Rodriguez on that final climb yesterday? No. In fact, you'd have to say they'd have probably been further off the front themselves, given what we've seen from both of them over the last few years. But Roglic doesn't need to panic, and one of his main assets as a bike rider is that he never does panic. We have to remember that he also crashed at the Tour of the Basque Country back in April, twice in fact. So although he didn't break any bones back then and would have been back on the bike fairly quickly after those crashes, his preparation has been interrupted. He also crashed twice during the Dauphiné last week. I think that's my biggest fear with him, getting through the Tour de France without hitting the deck, particularly in the chaotic opening first week of racing. If he does manage to stay rubber side down, he's going to be there or thereabouts, isn't he? But if it's a straight head-to-head battle against Pogačar or Vingegaard and they're on form, I can't see him winning, even though I'd like to see it. Next up, Remco Evenepoel. Now, he did break bones at the Tour of the Basque Country crash in April, and so he would have been off the bike longer than Roglic before he was able to start building back up. He went into the Critérium du Dauphiné saying that he wasn't going for the general classification, but was instead there to build his form and get back into the rhythm of racing. Because of that, it's hard to be too critical of his 8th place in the overall classification. He ticked the time trial box, putting heaps of time into all the other GC contenders, and then rode his own pace up the mountains. He would definitely be happy that there's almost 60 k's of time trialling at the Tour de France this year, but in my mind, there are still a lot of question marks over his ability to stick with the best day after day in the high mountains. Yes, I know he won the Vuelta a España, a Grand Tour, but that in the end wasn't against Roglic, nor Pogačar, nor Vingegaard. There's no doubt he's incredibly talented and still has time to improve, but in my mind, he's fighting for a podium place at the Tour and probably not the win. On to Pogačar then. After his 6-stage wins and the overall victory at the Giro d'Italia, he spent a week back in Monaco resting and recovering, but for the last week, he's been back at altitude in Tignes. Is he the best that he's ever been? Well, I'd say on results alone this year, yes he is. There hasn't been a single blip since he first competed at Strade Bianche. He's hit all his targets, and just as importantly when it comes to the Tour de France, he's not had a bad crash nor got ill, as far as we know at least. The question mark that hangs over Pogačar is the Giro, and whether that will hamper him come July. So the Giro d'Italia Tour de France double has been seen as almost impossible in recent times, with just 5 weeks between the two of them. It's not long enough to take a decent break and then rebuild fully, but at least the general consensus is that it's been too hard for a while. But if anybody can do it, Pogačar can. In most people's eyes, I think he's the favourite for the upcoming Tour de France, but that's mainly because none of us know how close Jonas Vingegaard will be to 100% of the Tour, or even if he will ride it at all. He had a collapsed lung, a broken collarbone and several broken ribs after that crash in the Basque Country, a horrific list of injuries. He remained in hospital in Spain for quite some time before then continuing his recovery at home in Denmark. Since then, he's been training in Mallorca and has since been on an altitude cab in Tignes himself for a few weeks. So he's been pictured training with his time trial bike in the background, but we really have no clue as to how well he's going and how much those injuries are still bothering him. Now, some people have been comparing it to Pogačar's situation this time last year. Of course, last year he broke his wrist at Liège-Bastogne-Liège, but I would say Vingegaard's injuries were far, far worse, quite obviously, and his time off the bike would have been a lot longer. I hope he's close to his best at the Tour de France, but there's no doubt his preparation has been severely hampered. And there was another blow for him last week, as Dylan van Baarle and Steven Kruijswijk both crashed out of the Dauphiné, and Sepp Kuss didn't look his normal self either, adding further woes to a season that couldn't have been more in contrast to 2023 for Visma Lease bike. So that's where we're at. None of those four will compete again ahead of the Tour de France that starts in Florence on the 29th of July. So we won't really have anything more to go on before then, unless one of them accidentally uploads to Strava with their power data. Now, I focused on the big four, as those have been the names on everyone's lips since they announced their respective race programs at the very start of this year. But I'm not going to count everyone else out, of course. It's going to be a very interesting Tour de France. Interesting to see how Bernal, Pidcock, Yates, Carapaz and others get on at the Tour de Suisse this week. And we've already seen how well the likes of Rodriguez and Jorgensen were going at the Critérium du Dauphiné. And what about Derek G? He could get a top 10, I reckon, if he rides for general classification rather than stage wins at the Tour de France, and that would really be quite something. Anyway, I would love to get your thoughts at home. What order are the big four going to finish in at the Tour de France? I'm going to say Pogačar, Vingegaard, Roglič, then Evenepoel, with a couple of other rides mixed between. Let me know in the comment section just down below. On to the rest of last week's races now, and I'll start with the Women's Tour of Britain. Firstly, well done to British Cycling for promoting the race at what was very short notice in the aftermath of former organiser Sweet Spot going into administration. It would have been awful to see the demise of the Women's Tour of Britain and indeed the men's, which comes later on this year. It was a race that was dominated by SD Works Pro Time almost from start to finish. A select group contested the win on the opening stage into Clanudno, and it was Letizia Paternoster of Live Alula Joko who raised her arms in celebration. Unfortunately, though, she hadn't won. Lotte Kopecky had pipped her to the line. Kopecky backed that up with another win the following day in Wrexham. She got away with Anna Henderson, riding for Great Britain at the race, and outsprinted her at the finish. The only full bunch sprint that we had came on day 3 into Warrington, and no surprise to see Lorena Vives take the spoils there. Although Charlotte Kool of Team DSM Firmenich did push her close most of the way to the line. And then we had stage 4, which was an utterly bizarre finish. It had been particularly aggressive, that final stage, under heavy rain, and we had a group of around 25 riders together as they came to the finish in Manchester. SD Works lined up with their 4 riders in the last K, Cecchini followed by Kopecky, then Majerus and Vibes. Kopecky went so fast, though, through the final turns that she gapped her teammates, but rather than pressing on for the win herself, she almost braked in the closing 200 metres. So then you're thinking, well, she must want to gift the win to Lorena Vibes. But then Vibes, she waves Majerus on and doesn't sprint herself. Majerus then celebrates way too early, and Ruby Roseman Gannon sneaks past her before the line to take her first ever win at World Tour level. SD Works really had egg on their face there. They finished 2nd, 3rd and 4th on that stage. I mean, in the greater scheme of things, it's not a huge blow for that team. They came away from that race with 3 stage wins and the overall classification, but how they got that so wrong, I do not know. Anyway, well done to Lotte Kopecky, the world champion, not just on wins over the 4 days, but on the way that she was with the fans, particularly the young fans there. There were a few clips going around on social media showing just how much time she was giving them, and it meant an awful lot to those youngsters. Moving on, the Tour de Suisse kicked off yesterday with a prologue around Vaduz. With rain on the forecast, most of the big name riders set off before live coverage had started. Topping the table was Yves Lampaert, who went around the 4.4Ks a full 3 seconds quicker than Stefan Bissegger, with Ethan Hayter in 3rd. Best of the GC riders was Joao Almeida in 4th. You can watch the rest of the Tour de Suisse on Discovery Plus this week, where you'll also be able to catch the Women's Tour de Suisse, plus the Tour of Belgium, which you'll also be able to watch over on Max in the US, and in which we'll see Philipsen, Merlier and Olaf Koy go up against each other in the sprints. Those are not to be missed. At the ZLM Tour, an opening time trial win paved the way to a general classification win for Rune Herregods. That's his first overall win at a race as a pro. Casper van Uden of Team DSM Firmenich came away with 2 stage wins himself, whilst Peter Schulting and Alexander Solby took the other 2 between them. Maxim van Hils came away with yet another one-day win at the Grand Prix Canton Argo on Friday. His results in one-day races have been quite exceptional this year, whilst Gianni Vermeersch took his first road win in more than 2 years at Dwars door het Hageland. Yet more wins were added to the long list of Marianne Vos's palmares last week at the Volta Catalunya. She took 2 second places on the 3 stages, plus a win and the overall general classification. And it was a 1-2 for Visma on the general classification, with Rianne Marcus in 2nd. In other news, Ellen van Dijk has fractured her ankle just 7 weeks out from the Olympic Games time trial. The Dutch woman crashed whilst out training. She'll have surgery on it, but hopes to be back training in 2 weeks. And finally, in transfer news, it looks like Jayco Alula are swapping out their GC leader. Dan Benson has been reporting that Simon Yates is on his way out after spending all of his 11-year professional career with that team, whilst Ben O'Connor, currently with Decathlon AG2R, is set to replace him. You can read all about that over on our website, which is globalcyclingnetwork.com. Right, that is all for this week's show. Thanks as ever for watching. I'll be back to wrap up 4 more stage races this time next week, so I'll see you then.